Now, I'd like to make one thing very clear before I even really start this rant. I love Alan Wake. I remember sitting and watching my older sister playing the game multiple times on her Xbox 360 before playing it myself and swearing for the first time ever in the logging yard. An appropriate reaction, I think, considering I was being chased by a man with a chainsaw. The little hints about what is to come when we first enter the town, fights that require a lot of strategies, or more accurately, a lot of screaming, an amazing cast of characters, and even the obvious product placements for Energizer and Verizon all help to make this game one of the staples for my childhood. When American Nightmare came out, my family was ecstatic. Heck, my sister owns the physical Alan Wake book. That's how much my family and I love the series. So you cannot even begin to imagine how hyped we were to learn that Alan Wake 2 was coming out. Finally, we'd get to adventure with Alan again, even if he wasn't wearing that stupid tweed jacket. We'd get to see what happened to Alan, Alice, Barry, and Sheriff Breaker. And, well, if you played the game, then you know that the latter half of the list doesn't really show up or have much to do with the game at all. Barry is mentioned, and you can ask if someone is related to Breaker, but that's about it. And that in itself would be fine. Expectations from the players are not a reflection of the quality of the work, even if it may impact how one enjoys the piece. That being said, there is a reason that I'm here, writing this, and recording this, and editing it, and whatnot. See, me and my family beat Alan Wake 2 on December 7th, 2023. And after getting to the end of the story, I opened my phone to find that the Game Awards were underway and that Alan Wake 2 had literally just won Best Narrative. And I really don't agree. Don't get me wrong, it's a good game. It could have been worse, though my sister, who was actually the one behind the controller, had some comments about the mechanics, but that has nothing to do with the narrative, so that doesn't matter. I'm not an expert in that. But there were some flaws that I do want to explore because I believe the darkness at the heart of this issue is one that impacts a lot of popular media, and I think it's time that we burn away the darkness with some light. Mind you, to do that, we need some light and batteries, which in this case is context, and yeah, this metaphor is gonna get away from me, so let's just jump right into the summary before it gets worse. What is Alan Wake? For those of you not in the know, Alan Wake follows a man named Alan Wake as he and his wife go for a vacation to Bright Falls, where there's a lovely little cabin in the middle of Cauldron Lake for them to stay in. A vacation that quickly turned into a nightmare thanks to the darkness, an evil presence that haunts said lake and that loves artists because it can possess them and make their work a reality. Unfortunately for the Wakes, both of them are artists. Alice is a photographer, and Alan is a famous horror writer known for his Alex Casey series, which can be very gruesome. I'm sure he'll be in for a fun time when that becomes real. While the darkness takes Alice, Alan is shown how to save her by pages of a manuscript he wrote but has no memory of, and the spirit of Thomas Zane, a poet who took on the form of a diver after his own battle with the darkness ended with him trapped in the dark place. This adventure has Alan uncovering more about those who have previously fought the darkness, the Lady of the Light, named Cynthia Weaver, who helped protect the town, the darkness main host, Barbara Jagger, and more about the whole town in general with the help of his friend and editor, Barry. Alan gets accused of a couple of murders and gets in trouble with the FBI, you know, typical holiday stuff, before he sacrifices himself to save Alice. As Alan plunges into the darkness, he is told by Thomas Zane that a double of him by the name of Mr. Scratch will take his place beside his loved ones, and then Zane goes off and fades away, presumably finally at peace after all these years. Alice is shown on the shore of Cauldron Lake, free from the darkness, and Alan sits in what is dubbed the writer's room and begins writing the manuscript for the adventure that just happened. Rose, a fan of Alan who's shown up occasionally in the story, is shown to be the new Lady of Light, while one of the FBI agents who wanted to arrest Alan, Nightingale, is shown to be the new host of the darkness, letting us know that while the battle is over, the war is not. And finally, the game ends with Alice's voice telling Alan it's time to wake up. Great sequel bait. And then we get Alan Wake, American Nightmare, the not-quite sequel. Alan runs around trying to deal with the fact that his doppelganger, Mr. Scratch, is kind of evil. And by kind of, I mean he's murdering a bunch of people while pretending to be Alan. Luckily, there's a manuscript that details exactly how everything needs to be to defeat Scratch. Alan ends up looping through the same 3 locations with the same characters, trying to make things perfect, but in each loop, things go differently, because it's not a loop, it's a spiral. The short game ends with Alice and Alan reuniting after the defeat of Scratch, except not, because this is all just happening in the dark place. This is all just a story he made up but cannot make real. The only thing he can do is reach his friend Barry, who is shown to be seeing all of this as a dream. Other than that, the only real thing is that the darkness can be seen as a metaphor for several things, but not limited to addiction, mental illness, and the plain old good versus evil shtick. Pretty much just anything that can be said to control a person's life. Because themes and ambiguity, they're good in writing, right? So, summary over. Now, we can go look a little more at the story that we're specifically reviewing. Or should I say the two stories? Duel-tagonists. Alan Wake 1 and 2 are stories told in chapters, and while the first game has a clear path from one point to the next, the second game is a little bit wonky in that regard. See, Alan Wake 2 follows two different protagonists. The first is, unsurprisingly, Alan, while the second is FBI agent Saga Anderson. She has come to Bright Falls to investigate a series of killings performed by a cult along with her partner, Agent Alex Casey. And yes, that's the fictional character Alan wrote, but he's not fictional anymore. He's a real person. I'm sure that's not going to cause problems down the line for the original game. Both Saga and Alan have their own chapters, but save for the opening and ending ones, you can play each section in whatever order you want. Do you want to ignore Saga completely and just play with Alan? Go ahead! Do you want to go back and forth? Sure. Maybe Saga's your favorite character ever, so you say screw Alan and just play as her until you're forced to do the other side. Okay. And you can do that, because despite the two stories seemingly being interconnected, they don't actually feel like they belong together. From a gameplay perspective, which does impact the narrative of the story, think of the way that the difference of having a flashlight or weapon impacts how we feel as we play, Saga's segment feels more akin to an action game than a horror game. It does make sense that a fully trained FBI agent would be more willing to stand her ground and fight than a writer who would lose his breath after running for 10 seconds, but knowing that you can fight feels a lot less scary than if you just had to run. Enemies feature weak points, something that was not in the first game, and battling in general is more prominent. In each one of Saga's sections, there are unavoidable fights and bosses. Most of her collectibles also spawn more enemies to fight. On the other side, only a portion of Alan's chapters have forced fights, something that's closer to what the original game had to offer. Players are also told early on when playing as Alan that they can turn off their light to avoid detection by the Taken, adding a stealth element. Heck, many of the Taken that Alan sees are not actually Taken, but shadows who will, at most, push him to the ground. But the thing that truly makes Alan's part different is that he doesn't really have boss fights. He has what I'm dubbing run for his life. Just the very fact that Alan cannot fight everything he comes across helps create a sense of hopelessness that Saga's sections just don't have. Of course, the tonal shifts aren't just from the gameplay. The only thing that really seems to connect Alan and Saga's story is the idea that both of them are trying to protect a loved one from the darkness. But in a way, Alan is to blame for Alice being there, and Saga is not to blame for her daughter Logan getting caught in all of this. And Alice haunts the narrative and is an ever-present element to Alan's psyche, whereas Logan, we hear for less than 30 seconds at the beginning of the game, and just don't know anything about her. It creates a sort of disconnect in the way that this is presented, which makes it hard for us to see it as a connection at all. It would be like saying Mass Effect and Halo are connected because both of them are trying to save the world from alien invaders. They cover similar topics, but that doesn't mean that they're one story. Plus, as I said before, you can switch between whose stories you're following whenever you want. The reason for this is that while the two impact each other, there are very few connections in the story that help them feel like one. Yes, there are moments where the two directly talk to one another, but spoiler alert, the only reason that the two stories can be played at the same time is to hide the fact that Alan's happened before Saga's. You could play each section on their own and not be missing any key piece of information. Even the fact that the two talk to each other in overlaps, spaces where the dark place has been able to break through to the real world, has little impact. In one, Saga meets Alan and learns he's trying to escape. In the second one, Saga asks if Alan part her family in the story, and then in the third and final one, she yells at him for endangering her family. Things that Alan doesn't really even hear in his version of the conversations because of the shoddy connection. Similarly, Saga struggles to understand what Alan is saying in these moments, an action that is used to cover the upcoming plot twist. In a sense, these moments really only serve to do two things. The first is practical and, to its credit, makes sense story-wise. By establishing that the two of them are able to talk and have a weird psychic connection, players are not too jarred by the conversation that the two have at the very end of the game, one that is actually impactful. If this had just magically happened at the end, it would have felt more akin to a deus machina, something that's convenient for the sake of the plot. In writing, you can't just make things happen. They have to be earned. The second reason for it is not as successful. By having the two converse, we create a connection between the two storylines. This is seemingly the answer that the writers of Alan Wake 2 came to when they asked themselves how to bring them back together. Something that Sam Lake mentioned being a key point in discussion around the writing tables during his IGN interview chat thing with John McAdam, one of the minds behind Marvel's Spider-Man 2. However, like I said, these connections just don't feel concrete. If the games were to remove every section where you play as Alan, or inversely, every section where you play as Saga, very little would have changed in the game itself. While Alan is the cause of all of Saga's problems, he doesn't need to be a dual-tagonist with her for her story to progress. Meanwhile, Alan only really needs Saga to hit the clicker one time to initiate the endgame where the two finally have a story that's connected. But, like I said, in writing, things have to be earned. And it doesn't feel like they've earned the need to work together. It doesn't feel like both need to make a sacrifice to defeat the darkness. It doesn't feel like dual-tagonists of one stories, but two stories pushed together to enlarge the runtime. So, we have two different stories in one game with two different tones, two different protagonists vying for screen time and attention. And, well, unfortunately, one clearly loses the fight for attention to the other. Saga Anderson. It shouldn't come as a surprise that people playing this game would be more interested in Alan's story. The game series is named after him, after all. This means that Saga Anderson was already at a disadvantage when she drove into Bright Falls vying for the place of hero of the story. That being said, it wouldn't be impossible to make the players care about her. She would just need to be a strong character who's well developed, and I don't think we really got that with her. The opening of a story, be it in a movie, a book, or video game, is meant to introduce the consumer to the world. It establishes the setting, what is generally accepted as normal in the world, and gives us a peek into the lives of the characters. In the first game, the opening comes in the way of Alan's nightmare, where we are introduced to Thomas Zane, the darkness and Taken, before he wakes up, and we walk around Bright Falls, where we meet important characters like Rose and the Anderson brothers, who we later learn have also fought the darkness. Finally, the Wakes make it to the cabin, where everything goes to hell. During this time, we see Alan interact with others, see his relationship with Alice, and learn about his general attitude towards things like fame and his current writer's block, along with his sense of humor. By the time Alice is taken by the darkness, we already have a clear idea of what we're working with. By virtue of it being a sequel, Alan Wake 2 should have more wiggle room with its opening. It doesn't need to explain the whole picture to the players. You can expect them to know about Bright Falls, Deerfest, and even a little about some reoccurring characters. Therefore, the opening should focus on introducing us to our main characters. Who is Saga Anderson and Alex Casey? Why are they in Bright Falls? How do they interact with one another? What are their strengths or weaknesses? Do they have a sense of humor? But we don't really get that. After an intro sequence in which we play as Nightingale, seemingly to fulfill the promise that the first game made of him being there, we see Saga coming to town, talk with Casey about the fact that she has a family, and then it throws us in to talk about the cult and the mystery. Saga gets told to take point because this is her kind of case, and that's about it. We don't get a lot about the characters' personalities or their relationship in this moment. To put into perspective how little we are shown about Saga's character, let me explain the Mind Palace, Saga's version of the menu. The palace is designed to look like the little meeting room she and Casey set up in the inn, and contains the collectibles we receive throughout the game, as well as her case board where she can put pieces of the puzzle together to remind the players what happened if they leave, and most importantly, the profiling table. At this table, Saga sits down and asks questions to a person she has met in-game. This is not just her musing about them or some mini-game that the player plays. Saga actually hears their voice in her head. One of the first people that you do this to is a couple who found the body that Saga and Casey are here to investigate, and when she asks what it is they're hiding from her in the Mind Palace, the mind version of them mentions a necklace that they found. Saga then asks them to give it to her in real life, and the pair wonder how she knew about it. It's literally dialogue in the game. When playing this part, we started asking questions about what the hell it was, because the dialogue suggested we should think about it, and we came to the conclusion that Saga is psychic, and that's part of why she doesn't question things like magically appearing manuscript pages. It would also explain why this was her kind of case, and why Casey wanted her to take point. There's something supernatural going on in this town, so let's send in the psychic. It's clearly what happened, right? Then, halfway through the game, Saga comes to the realization that she has psychic powers. Which means that, for half of the game, we had the wrong idea about Saga and her understanding of the world, and it just didn't matter. Nothing came up to contradict and show her true character. She just doesn't give a damn that all this impossible stuff is happening around her. And it's her kind of case because why not? No idea why Casey made her take point, but that stuff set up at the start of the game isn't important, so why should it matter, right? This wasn't a problem in the first game, as a lot of characterization for Alan came through the way that he narrated what was happening around him in his head. We saw the world through him and his art. But Saga is not an artist or writer of any sort. She doesn't narrate her actions, save for a couple moments where she comments on what a manuscript says or insists that her daughter isn't dead. And it's not like they just went without narration in the game. Alan narrates the entirety of his sections, another thing that just shows how different the two parts of the stories are. Even if you haven't played the first game, you quickly gauge that Alan is a writer who is tired, gruff, and a little unhinged at times, who just wants to protect that which is important to him. He's confused by what's happening around him and haunted by his writing, but is so used to everything that's happened up until this point and is past the point of no return, so he just keeps trying, desperate to reach his one goal of saving Alice no matter the cost. The most characterization that Saga gets is really at the end of the game. Well in her mind palace before entering the dark place, Saga is haunted by her insecurities and is forced to face them. Her worst fears are shoved into her face, telling her that she isn't enough, and she pushes past them all with confidence thanks to the memories of her mom and daughter, but not her husband, who she seemingly also loves but isn't important, I guess, and her achievements. This highlights her iron will and focus. But there was no reason to think she had these insecurities in the first place. Heck, her insecurities about her family only exist because of the dark place messing with her head and changing reality around her, and she has full confidence in her investigative abilities throughout the piece, so I don't know where that came from. What struggles did Saga have before she drove into Bright Falls? Was she just a perfect person? By leaving the parts where you flesh out your main character until the end of the story, you leave the reader lost. They have nothing to connect with, and then they just don't care. A problem that is made worse by the fact that, on the other side of the coin, as a character that we do know a lot about and do care for because of a whole other game worth of content. I will also add that this forced characterization at the end puts a damper on the story as a whole itself in this specific incident. If we rewind back to when I was explaining the game, you might remember that I said that the darkness was a metaphor for pretty much anything that had control over your life. By forcing this section into the game, that complexity is lost. The darkness very specifically becomes an allusion to mental illness in a way that sort of insults the player's intelligence. It feels almost as if the game doesn't trust you to understand what it wants to say or is unwilling to allow you to come to your own conclusion. The exact opposite of what Sam Lake and his team wanted. They wanted ambiguity in the story, and they got that, but not in the theme. At the end of the day, if Saga had been replaced by another FBI agent, very little in the story would have changed. Sure, she's unique in that she has psychic powers and is randomly connected to the Anderson brothers, that they just forcibly made that up, but that's not something that makes a character. There's no reason for it to be Saga who comes to Bright Falls with Casey. What makes her stand out? I really wanted to like Saga. I did! I just wish that there was more to Saga to explore and understand. Luckily, I think there will ultimately be more for Saga. More journeys for her to go on, and more mysteries to solve. A space where she can expand as a character on her own. Unluckily, the same reason I think she'll have more room to grow is cause of some of the bad bits in the game. The bad bits. In 2008, Marvel Studios released the first set of movies that would become the base for their cinematic universe, also known as the MCU, or as I like to call it, the start of the end. Suddenly, every franchise wanted to create some type of twisted, integrated universe. And it makes sense in a way. The MCU was popular and brought in a ton of money. Every new installment promised to bring in new eyes while keeping those who had already been sucked in entertained. It cannot die if you keep pumping it with artificial blood. What does this have to do with Alan Wake? Well, it actually has to do with Remedy, the studio that made the game. The next big game that the company made after Alan Wake was Quantum Break, a game where a man named Jack Joyce deals with time travel shenanigans, and that was full of small nods to the company's previous title. And these Easter eggs made sense. It was clear that Sam Lake really loved the story. Heck, back in 2017, Lake confirmed in an interview with Eurogamer that Quantum Break was originally an early concept for Alan Wake 2, but that the story was changed because Microsoft was, quote, looking for a new IP. They wanted to own that. Alan Wake is ours. So that was off the table. But that didn't stop people from wondering if the two were connected, and their next game, Control, answered that question. Kind of. Control follows a woman named Jessie Faden who receives a telepathic message with a hint about her missing brother, only to end up in the headquarters of the FBC, an organization that's meant to keep supernatural shit or altered world events in check. Oddly enough, things go terribly wrong in a place trying to contain a bunch of world-bending phenomena, and Jessie is named director of the agency as soon as she walks into the door, leaving her in charge of fixing everything. The game then came out with DLC, including the AWE DLC, and oh my gosh, look, there's Alan, and the darkness, and some people in deer masks. Wonder if those masks will be seen again. Oh hey, look, we officially have the Remedy universe. Now, the thing is, this universe can be pretty complicated. I mean, the base of Alan Wake's story is that the world is changing around him because of his writing, so of course, trying to add more things like time travel and a whole agency is gonna make it a mess. And it only gets more confusing if you don't have context of there being a universe in the first place. See, when I said that as a child I was a fan of Alan Wake, I meant just that. I wasn't a fan of Remedy, but of one game. The idea of looking into the studio and creative minds behind the game didn't even occur to me back then. That means that when I heard of Alan Wake 2, I had very little idea about the rest of the company's work. I knew Control existed, but never played it, and had no idea Quantum Break was even a thing. That meant that when playing Alan Wake 2, I had no idea who Audie, Tim, or Door were supposed to be. I kept waiting for the shoe to drop. Why had Tim been brought to the Dark Place? How was Audie here and there? What impact would Door have on the story? And then the ending came, and there was nothing. A whole chunk of the story felt empty to me because I hadn't played a game released in 2017 or one from 2019. Making an homage to your previous works is nothing new. In the original Alan Wake, Casey was designed to be an homage to Max Payne, the protagonist of another IP that Remedy worked on. There's nothing wrong with these kind of small Easter eggs. The problem comes when these go from cute little nods to being baked into the core of the story. While you can argue that a game can assume you played the first in a series, it's not fair to expect them to know everything about anything even slightly adjacent to it. A good example of how it should work is the Dot Hack series, a game series I am specifically going to reference because the first one I ever played was Dot Hack GU Volume 2. I knew nothing about the original Dot Hack, something that has a clearer link between the two series than Control or Quantum Break has to Alan Wake, and was still able to very quickly understand what was happening in the world and with Haseo. Heck, even though I hadn't seen the first game, I was able to understand what was happening, what characters were like, and enjoy the experience, because it was able to stand on its own. Even though a version of the main character of Dot Hack, Kite, was put into Dot Hack GU, I was still able to understand who this person was supposed to be because of little information that the game gave you, but also because it wasn't the heart of the story. It didn't matter too much that Kite was the hero before. It doesn't matter that Haseo was actually a player in the original world, or that in Roots he was a part of this other guild, because the game gave you the information you needed to understand what was happening in the moment that you were exploring it. Even if knowing another piece can enhance it, the story itself should feel complete in a vacuum. But that's not the case for Alan Wake 2. During the production of other Remedy titles, Alan Wake 2 was constantly at the back of Sam Lake's mind. He was, as he put it in the previously mentioned IGN interview, thinking about it and always kind of building certain things. In this way, the different games naturally began to weave themselves into the world of Alan Wake by the time the sequel happened. This might not be a problem for other series. I'm sure someone could sit down and watch Captain Marvel or Black Panther without seeing other MCU stories and still get the scope of the entire thing. But Alan Wake 2 has an over-reliance on ambiguity. The team intentionally left many things open to interpretation and refused to answer certain questions to keep the players thinking about the game and how it all works. But to fully understand the conversation surrounding these questions, you need to fully understand the world it takes place in. You need to know about Quantum Break and Control to know Alan Wake 2, something that isn't guaranteed for new or even old players. In this way, the game becomes contaminated by the bits tying it to other Remedy titles, and also a little bit by having knowledge of the original game. Hey, remember the actual story of Alan Wake? It probably wouldn't be a surprise to anyone to figure out that the story of Control and Quantum Break wasn't exactly in anyone's mind when the original Alan Wake was produced. Seeing as Remedy didn't want Microsoft to have Alan Wake as one of the IPs, we can probably also assume that Alan Wake was not originally meant to be tied to the core of Quantum Break's story. And I'm not even going to pretend like I know what they were thinking when they made Control, because I am not a psychic and have no information to try and make a guess. And because ultimately it doesn't matter. What does matter is the fact that by the time they got writing Alan Wake 2 and decided to tie it into the Remedy universe, a number of things were altered from the original story to fit the Easter eggs and references that had morphed into something more. Beyond that, there's also the fact that 10 years had passed from the game's development, so things changed. Ideas are reformed, production elements are taken into account, and things hit the cutting room floor. Some of these changes are small and can be seen as just details we weren't told before, like Thomas Zane's lamp being where the clicker came from. We weren't told about any lamp in the first one, but sure, why not? Let's go with that. There are other changes, though, that stand out and make very little sense. Like Thomas Zane himself. Why the heck is he suddenly a filmmaker? In the original game, it is made very clear that Zane was a poet. However, in the sequel, Zane is suddenly a filmmaker. Cynthia Weaver, a character who was connected to Zane in the first game, even comments on the fact that it changes, but nothing ever comes of it. It feels as if it was changed for no reason. Unless you saw the Thomas Zane Easter egg that was in Control, where Jesse is told by a therapist that there wasn't a poet by that name, but there was a filmmaker. If you don't have that context, like I didn't until I was writing this part of the script, you'd be waiting for the shoe to drop. Clearly, this is a fake Zane since it's pretending to be a filmmaker, and Zane found peace at the end of the other game and was finally able to die. But no, he's there for a section of Alan's story and then just sort of disappears. There's also the fact that Casey is real and alive, despite Alan writing Casey as a fictional character and killing him off in the last book of a series, which ended up causing his writer's block. The most egregious examples, though, are the ending of the original game and the events of American Nightmare. The original game ended with the promise that the loop would continue once again with new players, namely Rose and Nightingale. Remember how, when I was describing the game, I mentioned that Rose was the new Lady of the Light and Nightingale was the new host for the Darkness? Well, that was pretty much thrown out. Rose shows up in the game, and there are some hints that maybe she's working with Alan, but she's hardly a guide or support against the darkness. And even the working with Alan thing is kind of thrown out the window at the end when Alan finally sees Rose and tells her, "No, I wasn't sending you any messages." Also, as a side note, I'm pretty sure Rose has murdered people, not just taken. She mentions burying bodies, but the taken bodies all just vanished, so yeah, that's not very Lady of the Light-like. Nightingale, meanwhile, certainly has the dark presence inside of him at the start, so that's good. He's just been in the light, and then when he crawls out, gets killed, and very quickly doesn't matter. He's not the host of the darkness at all. The promise players were given in the original was forgotten and now will never be fulfilled. Oh, and the events of American Nightmare are just completely forgotten. Literally. Alan shows no signs of remembering beating Mr. Scratch, and the murders that Scratch supposedly did were completely ignored. Oh, but that's because it was all in the dark place. Except Barry being psychically able to see everything, as we saw at the end when he woke from the nightmares. But, that doesn't matter. So you can pretty much just skip that entire game. Ironic, considering the requirements of playing the other games, if that Remedy is produced. But speaking of psychic abilities, Alan has them. While Alan Wake 2 does technically build this up by presenting echoes in the same way that Saga's profiling goes, there's no trace of this in the original. And if Alan's writing really were just stories he gathered from whoever he randomly connected to, why did he write Casey dying when Casey is very much alive? Why did he write about a zombie ghost attack in the first horror story he wrote at 18 years old? That's right, I have access to the original limited collector's edition. Be jealous. How did psychic powers not come up at any point in his life prior? The biggest offense of this, though, is the clicker itself. Not just what lamp it comes from, but the abilities it had. See, in the original game, Alan needed the clicker so that when he dove into the lake, he could turn on the light and get through the thick ocean of darkness. He uses it as a weapon to expel the dark presence from Barbara Drager. He doesn't use it to cause the changes in the story. And yet, in Alan Wake 2, the clicker is suddenly an object of power, something from Control's storyline. Instead of being something that can just get rid of darkness, the clicker is something that can cause changes in the story to happen. Even if we say that the clicker has just gained some new powers over the years, we still need to know why the clicker seems to have lost its other powers. See, when Alan first gets the clicker, he presses the button because of course he does, it's a button. Then Alan goes outside and despite it being nighttime before, it's suddenly the middle of the day. And he comments on it, so it's not just that he decided to hang out for hours on end inside of this one room. So why then did it not change from night to day when Saga used the clicker after the Anderson Bring Alan Back concert? Mind you, that's not the only problem that the clicker causes for the story of Alan Wake 2. Hey Alan, you got a plot hole. It is established that the clicker is what has the power to change events based on the art of another in the sequel. However, the story is already changing long before Saga grabs the clicker. The moment she steps into Bright Falls, her reality is changing. At the very start of the game, we see Rose working at the cafe instead of the retirement home. Does she work at both? Did her job change because of the story? What happened there? We don't know. When Saga talks to her, Rose mentions that Saga is a resident of the town and that Logan, her child, had drowned. This means that we can safely say that the events were changing from the moment Saga's feet touched the probably contaminated soil. But how did that change manage to happen without the clicker? Sure, everything is a spiral, and in the new Game Plus ending, which I'll talk about later, past is affecting present, but there has to still be a start to everything. How did that change manage to happen without the clicker? Because there still has to be a trigger and the start, and the whole Logan is dead thing is what caused her to go on this quest in the first place. So where's the start of this spiral? If we went with the idea that darkness can create things, despite us being told that it can't, and with this idea that Saga's just a creation made entirely for the sake of the story, which would in turn allow Alan to change her backstory on a dime and cause the whole, ooh, Logan's dead, why would they need the clicker at all? The darkness could just change everything without the clicker, like it could in the first game. Adding elements of time travel to your story will always lead to endless questions about when and how, and being paired with whatever the heck's going on with the clicker, things only get worse. The story inevitably suffers in the face of the complexity of the rules and reasons aren't established. And in this case, it was left a mystery for the sake of ambiguity. The need to make the game more complex, to get a final surprise over the player, and the need to link it to the rest of the games in the Remedy universe has left the final shape of the game a mere shadow of what the original was. But don't worry, we got New Game Plus. After the Game Awards, Alan Wake 2 released a patch which allowed the players to do a New Game Plus. This feature allowed Nightmare Mode runs, let you bring over your weapons, but not your ammo, and added a handful of new scenes. Now, we can assume that these scenes were always meant to be put into the game at some point, seeing as they were live action, meaning they were shot during the original production schedule. Seemingly, this was added later on to either give more time to edit these little cutscenes, or to help create the effect of the looping story, or, maybe to create more conversation around the game after the first wave had died out. But I'm not a marketing strategist, I don't know, I can't say for sure. Part of this is a new ending. So I stopped the writing of the script to give the new content some time to settle, be understood, digest it. And then I saw the ending, and I hated it even more, because the new ending doesn't answer questions or present new possibilities. It simply takes away from what was already established of the story and from writing in general. I've already mentioned that you need to earn things in writing, and that's not some new concept. Alan himself makes a point of saying that in the first and second game. That's why he can't just go, and then everybody lived happily ever after. The end. Yay! That's why, in the end, Alan tells Saga that there needs to be a sacrifice. Alan needs to sacrifice himself, and Saga needs to pull the trigger, become the new front line in the fight against the darkness. It's not fully clear what she's giving up. She just gets exactly what she wants, so I don't know, man. But they do it. She shoots Alan with the light bullet and the darkness leaves Alan's head. Then the new ending came out and showed us that the darkness left Alan's head and caused everything to happen again, until now. There's cell reception in the dark place, so we know that Logan's alive. That little bit of ambiguity in question is just answered. Oh, and now Alan's alive, despite there being a bullet in his brain. And he has the knowledge needed to be the master of many worlds. So, the sacrifices they made to earn their ending are just written out of existence. So, who was the person that sacrificed for the sake of this ending? Well, it was Alice Wake, by taking her own life, or maybe she just made Alan think she took her own life, that one's unclear. She helped the story come to its end. This would be impactful if Alice was a main character, but she was barely a character at all. Saga knew nothing about Alice, and Alan had already had to face the fact that Alice was dead in the course of the game. It drove him insane, so really there was nothing new. In this way, Alice's sacrifice feels more like a deus ex machina designed to keep a beloved character around than a fitting end for the game, and certainly not fitting enough for playing the game twice. Final thoughts. Alan Wake as a series is undeniably a work of love. Sam Lake and the team at Remedy has some fascinating ideas and an unimaginable amount of creativity. The blend of live action and animation, the music and dance sequences, there's a lot to praise about Alan Wake 2. But a complex narrative that ties in on itself doesn't automatically make a great story. It can attract many curious eyes. One need only look at FNAF to see the impact that leaving ambiguity in your story, and not just in the theme, can have on the rapid growth of the audience, but ambiguity does not beget a good narrative. So that's why, at the end of the day, I can't agree with the Game Awards. Alan Wake 2 is definitely not the best narrative of 2023. Then again, after the way they treated many of their studios and developers, who really cares what the Game Awards think? Alright, rant done. Thank you for doing whatever it is you did to hear me say this. Have a great day, stay safe, and goodbye.